it's makes it a lot easier to sort of get a toehold in a market. If there's a wine that, let's say wholesales below $25 or
Mm,
$25, something like that. If there's something that ideally it's even a little bit lower than that, something that could be potentially by the glass, but just something that feels like distributors feel like, okay, I can keep 7, 12, 14 cases of this on hand and it's not blowing up my inventory. And then what they might do is bring in a sprinkling of some of the higher priced
yeah.
thing.
Hello, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon from wherever you are joining in today's webinar. I'm Ankita, the head of events at Sommelier Choice Award and Beverage Trade Network. We have our speaker of the day, that's Jane Lopes, who's a co-founder at Legend Imports. And the webinar that we would be guiding you through today is how Australian wineries can connect with US consumers. Welcome on board. First of all, Jane, thank you so much for joining. Why don't we start with a little bit of your introduction? We know you have been a co-founder, we know you have been an educator, a sommelier by the profession, but anything that you would like to add, and especially why you have selected Australia as a region that you would like to represent?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, and thanks everybody for joining. My husband and I like to say that Australia kind of chose us. We met working in restaurants in New York. We worked at 11 Madison Park and kind of fine dining restaurants. In New York, and I got a job offer in late 2016 to run the wine program at a restaurant called Attica in Melbourne. So yeah, we said, why not? We moved to Australia and we just really fell in love with it and with the wines and really felt like it was a shame that they were so underrepresented and really misrepresented in the United States. And yeah, so we wanted to change that.
And tell us more about Legend Imports, like what you guys do and what is this about in the US market, especially for the Aussies brand?
Yeah, so Legend, so we started in 2020. So we were in Australia for 3 years and then we came back and started in 2020, which could have been a better time to start a
So,
wine imports business, but we just got a little bit of wine on the water and kept growing from there. We have about 30 different producers in our book, all Australian wine. We really wanted to kind of just have that very specific focus on Australian wine. And we kind of feel like we wear a lot of hats. It is just my husband and I at the company. And so we're kind of handling everything from logistics and compliance and getting labels approved and organizing, shipments and stuff like that. But then, definitely education, in-person market work,
correct.
coming up with creative ideas for incentives. We just did a trip
Okay.
and took US trade to Australia. So, we're kind of just sort of all in one, the actual logistics of importing wine, but then the
Right.
the sales of it too, and the creation of opportunities.
Amazing, amazing. So let's dive into our questions directly and see what our brands have to ask you. So I think the common question which most of them have asked is, what are the most important factors that you consider when you select Australian wines for your portfolio? So you said you already work with 30 producers. So what is your idea, or what in general any importer who is importing Australian wines right now in US ideally go for the selection process?
A lot of the producers in our portfolio, we had relationships when we lived in Australia with. So part of it was sort of an existing relationship. But certainly, our criteria, and I don't think we have like we don't have like a specific bullet points of you have to hit all of these. For
Mm,
us, we have to feel excited about the producer. I think that should be a given for anyone who's gonna sell your wine, and we feel the same when we go about selecting distributors to work with. We don't want someone who's sort of lukewarm about our wines.
true.
And just the same, we want to be really excited about the producers that we're working with. Certainly now that we have a portfolio already, we're looking for how those wines would interact with the wines we already have in our portfolio, and making sure that there's sort of enough differentiation that nothing is sort of cannibalizing anything else in the portfolio. The wines have to be great at the end of the day, and we have to feel like
True.
there's going to be excitement around them when we bring in them into market. A great story certainly helps, having sort of a narrative that people can really relate to and turn around and use in storytelling when they're selling the wines. And that can look like a lot of different things, like it can look like everything from super historic sort of storied winery to a husband and wife upstart that's really been, you know, taking a unique angle in their region or whatever it is. And then we have a few kind of further things we look for in terms of, we want there to be some sort of commitment to sustainability for our portfolio.
Right.
We sort of enumerate everyone's labor and environmental practices on our website, and so we like to be really transparent about that sort of stuff. Um, and it doesn't need to all be like certified organic or something, but we like to work with people who care about the environment, which fortunately is most sort of smaller producers. And so, but we want to make sure we always kind of have those conversations and are really transparent about all of that.
Amazing. So I think it's a great selection process, or I would say it's a great way to see which which wines would you like to add to your portfolio. Do you also, just a added question, do you also see or select those brands who are, let's say, as you said, could be small, could be medium, but also that provides a little bit of marketing support to you, a little bit of helping you in terms of making sure that there's enough noise which can be made through social or let's say to US before even the wine starts reaching to the market?
100%. And that's a really good question. There's probably one producer in our portfolio who we can kind of sell without their support. And
Wow.
I'll let anyone that goes on our portfolio or our website probably can figure out who that is. But for pretty much everyone, it needs to be a partnership, right? And we
Right.
feel the same way when we go into market with distributors. There's not a distributor that we work with in the United States who we're just like, here, you figure it out.
Right.
Like, oh, you want to work with the wines? Great. Send us a purchase order and then it's not our problem anymore. That's not the way it works. And especially with Australian wine in the United States, there really does need to be support and a partnership. And that's not something we kind of had the experience to articulate up front, but it is something
Mm.
we absolutely articulate now. And I don't think it quite works if the winery isn't willing to support. And that can look
Right.
like a lot of different things. It can look like most commonly is sort of making trips over to the US to help in the sales
Right.
efforts, but it can also be about helping to fund incentive programs in the US or even like
Mm.
creating merch or hats,
True.
t-shirts, something like that, or helping fund a trip of bringing US trade to Australia, all those sorts of
Right.
things. We feel like and if certainly we don't want to ask for more than people are getting out of the relationship either. We want it to feel
Mm.
fair. Um, but I think it really needs to be looked at, yeah, as a partnership.
How much does, as you said, this is one of an important criteria as well. So, how much does brand storytelling influence an importer's decision to take on a wine? So, we all understand that it has to be connected with the consumer, it has to be connected with you, with distributor. But how much of an importance does it hold when anyone has to work, especially the importers and distributors for any wine brand, so Australian wine brand?
And I think there's certainly some accounts, some retailers and restaurants who it's not important for, right? Who kind of are just gonna
Mm.
put it on the shelf and maybe there's a shelf talker that has some points on it or something like that. But I
Right.
think for most of the ways that we want to promote premium wine in the United States, it's hands-on, right? And a lot of Australian wine right now is more of a hand sell. There's not
Correct.
people for the most part are not walking into restaurants and retailers and asking for Australian wine. And when we hope to change that, and that will certainly make life easier for all of us. But at the moment, it really does depend on a retailer or restaurant getting excited about your wine and your story. And I think those go hand in hand. And I think depending on the buyer, one might kind of have a greater sway than the other. But I think that you kind of ideally have a really strong wine matched with a really strong story that gets people excited to sell the wines.
Okay, this is an interesting one. So, what are some common mistakes that you think Australian wineries make when they try to enter the US market?
I mean, I think it's very easy to feel like beggars can't be choosers, and we certainly feel that way
Yeah.
when we're going out and getting our distribution relationships, where sometimes we feel like, you know, that there's just not a lot of people clamoring for a whole big
Mm,
Australian portfolio to enter their distributors. So we feel like we kind of got to go with whoever wants to work with us. But I do think
mm,
actually the good news about that is that it is relatively self-selective. You know,
mm,
I've talked to a lot of friends who work for American wineries who've kind of been burned because they've been like the cool kid winery that everyone wants to work with, and they have their pick of distributors, and so they end up going with the cool kid distributor. But once you kind of fall out of that fresh and new and everyone's excited about you, are you going to have a distributor who's really interested in doing the work to build your brand when it's not easy? And I think
right.
that's actually the good thing about being Australian wine is because it is self-selective for the most part. You know, people know it's not going to be easy. You know, we don't have conversations with distributors where they're just like, oh, yeah, I mean, people just can't, like, I just get asked for Australian wine all the time and it's going to be so easy to sell these wines. Like, kind of no one's saying that. And what that means though is any sort of distributor or importer relationship that you end up having, they hopefully know that it's going to be a bit of a challenge, then it's going to require some legwork.
Push. Yeah.
You know, I think one thing we've tried to do with our portfolio and one mistake we made in the early days was sort of having too many wines from
Mm,
producers. Because I think it becomes difficult for any one distributor to sort of work with all of the wines. And it also can dilute sort of the brand story you're trying to tell, right? Where it's like if you have 12 wines from an individual producer, it can
right.
be hard for sort of one, for any one distributor to feel like they can add all of that to their portfolio, but two, to kind of for there to be a really concise story about the brand. And I think that's been something that we've worked on. And it also just makes sales easier, right? If you're trying to promote, let's say 12 wines from your
Mm,
winery and you're kind of having to put effort into all of them and get, you know, samples out there for all of them. Um, and kind of manage stock levels for all of them. It's a lot more difficult than if you said, okay, here are the four wines that we want to be successful in the United States, and we're gonna really get behind these four wines, keep it really limited, keep the story concise, make sure there's plenty of stock on those wines. That is one kind of mistake we made that looking back that we would have switched is just sort of being a little bit more concise with each producer's story.
great. Let me just add a small question here for you. So, what makes it hard for you to work with any of the wineries?
So we have found that, you know, distributors are very reluctant, and this certainly applies to Australian wine, but would apply to other categories as well, are reluctant to kind of keep a lot of stock on, you know, higher end wines.
Okay.
So we've
Yeah.
found that it's makes it a lot easier to sort of get a toehold in a market if there's a wine that, you know, let's say wholesales below $25 or 20
Mm,
$25, something like that. If there's something that ideally it's even a little bit lower than that, something that could be potentially by the glass, but just something that feels like distributors feel like, okay, I can keep 7, 12, 14 cases of this on hand and it's not blowing up my inventory. And then what they might do is bring in a sprinkling of some of the higher priced
yeah.
thing from that producer. We've found when we've tried to introduce wines that are sort of all like from a producer that are all at a certain price point, like a higher price
Mm,
point, it's a little bit hard. And we find that we
just
end up
mm,
kind of fully pre-selling those wines, meaning we go into market where there's not stock and we show samples that
mm,
we've brought into market and hoping to get pre-orders on them. And that's
mm,
just as never as effective as when the wines are
right.
in stock with the distributor. They, you know, they have them on hand. The reps know that they're there to sell. The accounts know they can get them the next day. I mean, that's
Correct.
always the ideal scenario. And then you can also build that brand awareness with some of the lower price stuff. People are like, okay, cool. I really, Patrick Sullivan's a great example, a Chardonnay producer we work with, who previously we only had sort of stuff starting at like 40 wholesale. Um,
Mm,
and they're like absolutely gorgeous wines, but now that we have something that's like around 20 wholesale, that wine can make a bigger splash throughout the market, get more
mm,
people on board who are like who can stock that, who can maybe even pour it by the glass, but or can have it, really affordable on their bottle list and or
right.
a really affordable retail bottle. And then you develop fans for that producer who are like,
Correct.
oh, cool, I love this wine. It's doing well for me. I want to see what else there is. But when you
Right.
just have that higher price level, it's harder to get a kind of a hook in the market.
How should wineries think about pricing and positioning to stay competitive in the US? So we kind of have answered it already, but anything that you would like to add here, like what sort of pricings are working, what sort of position that they should be ready to do and crack in the US market?
As most people would know, like the trends are moving towards premiumization in
Mm,
the world of wine. So I don't think you need to come at the US with like a $6 wholesale wine or something like
yes,
that. But
correct.
there is definitely a benefit to have something in that like by the glass price point. And obviously that
Mm,
translates to a certain retail price point. And for us, that kind of looks like, sort of anywhere from 10, 11 to like sort of as high as 18. And I'm talking about
mm,
wholesale, so what the accounts would pay, what a restaurant or a
mm,
retailer would pay. So obviously it's going to be sort of a standard distributor markup in
mm,
the US is to basically do about $1 a bottle for laden. So for the cost that it takes for them to get wine to their warehouse. And then, sort of, it's very complicated over here. So some states can only have one price, some states have five different prices, some states can price things however they want to on any given day. But typically they'll be looking at like sort of 30 to 40 points for their pricing.
mm,
40 would be the very high end for like a frontline, like a one bottle sort of price. But typically, if you
mm.
do have multiple pricing, it'll be like bottle, a
30.
case, 3 Ks, something like that. And maybe getting down to the lowest being kind of between 25 and 30 points. But then, your importer margin, and I think importers work with different conversion rates. We
Mm,
try to be pretty lean on that so we can kind of get wines to the market pretty aggressively, but we have been burned if we happen to pay at a really poor exchange rate.
right.
But in general, if you can sort of work with your importer to get something in the market that can be in that sort of lower BTG range, I'd say like
Mm,
11 to 15, 16. I think that is sort of a solid price point for getting some by the glass placements, getting some solid retail placements, getting some wine club placements. We get a lot of wine club requests at that kind of lower end of that things are going to hit 10, 11, 12 wholesale. And that just, starts giving you those bigger volume hits. And then the distributors, when they can put together larger orders, they can tag on some of the higher end stuff. So I think,
correct.
thinking about having some wines in that sort of by the glass price point can be really, really useful.
Are there any specific Australian varietals or styles that you think is currently in demand?
Australian Shiraz is sort of the one
Hmm.
style that's the one Australian style that people say this is Australian, right?
Yeah.
And so I do think there is a benefit to that you don't have competition from other categories, right? If it's going to be Shiraz, it's
Hmm.
going to be Australian. Obviously, Northern Rhone Syrah, whatever, kind of different sort of thing. But I do think there is a ceiling to that, and I think a lot of the work we're doing is trying to show people like, hey, you actually don't need to have a Napa Cab by the glass. You could have a really excellent Australian Cabernet. Same with Chardonnay, same with Pinot Noir, same with Sauvignon Blanc. Australia does a lot of these sort of classic grapes really, really well at competitive price points that I
Mm.
think can really kind of beat out some of the American and French wines for, quality at value. So I don't know if there's anything in particular, but and I do think it's what you get behind and what you get excited about and what you get your distributors excited about. We've done really well with the Chalmers family's wines, and I literally was showing a wine today that was Piedi Rosso and Pavana and Schioppettino and Sagrantino, and certainly no one is like asking for those grapes pretty much at all, but certainly from Australia. But if it's a great wine, great value, you can get behind it, you can get your distributors behind it. There is opportunity, and I think hopefully more and more there will be opportunity to show a unique side of Australia that we don't just have to play into these, handful of kind of core grapes.
Correct.
We can say, hey, McLaren Vale actually does really cool alternative varieties. Like there's great Marsan and
Right.
Fiano and like Menthea coming out of McLaren Vale, and let's make sure that identity is expressed too. So, you know, I think there can be a way in which those are certainly harder sales, but I do think there's something to be said for like authenticity and brand story. And
Right.
when something's really good and exciting and the packaging is good and the pricing is good, there can be room for it in the market.
True, yes. And it's well said that authenticity is something that people are actually looking for nowadays. So if we can just promote that uniqueness, I think that will definitely bring more value and more demand for it. What's the
Yeah, totally.
best way for a small or mid-sized winery to connect with importers and distributors? I think the question here is also what are the different ways that they can connect to, where to find you guys, and what are the best process to follow to get into at least a conversation with an importer?
Yeah, I mean, there's only really a handful of Australian importers to
Mm.
the United States. I think there's probably like 10, and I think there are only three of us that are exclusively Australian. So those names are not hard to find. Um, so I do think, we get emails quite frequently of people who are, hey, interested in coming to the market. And we're always happy to have a conversation, even if we're not necessarily looking for someone at that moment. I will say my impression with kind of the way the economy is right now and potential tariffs and all those things that
Mm.
not a lot of people are actively onboarding. But there's definitely been moments where we were not actively onboarding and someone really surprised us and we were like, actually, this could really work.
Yeah.
I will say, and I didn't mention this before in terms of like important factors and stuff, but it can be helpful to get good international points for your wines. It's
Mm.
certainly not the end all be all, and we know how flawed sort of the point system can be. It's certainly not a perfect representation of good wines, and we've seen the same exact wine get 94 points from someone and 88 from someone else.
True.
And there's certainly a subjective element to it. But if you have, and so I'd say from Australia, you'd be looking at submitting to Wine Advocate, James Suckling, Decanter, Venice. All of those places are, you can send samples directly from Australia. You can't submit directly from Wine Spectator or Wine Enthusiast or Wine and Spirits like the U.S. ones. But if you can get some good points on your wines in Australia, that can be helpful. And
True.
there's still a good amount of retailers in particular in the United States who do use points to sell wine. And especially when it's sort of an unproven category, for them to come out
Mm.
with an Australian Grenache or Chardonnay or Cabernet and say, okay, well, you might not be familiar with this producer or this region or this style, but hey,
They
Wine
have
Advocate
one.
gave this 97 points, so you should pay
True.
attention. So that's
Yeah.
that's never a bad thing, but I would advise people to focus on those international ones. Like James Halliday, unfortunately, doesn't just mean
Mm.
too much to the American market. So I know I deviated a little bit from that, but I think if I mentioned importers, if someone is interested in going the path of distributors and looking to import directly and reach out directly to distributors, that tends to be a little bit of a harder game to play because very few distributors right now are really interested in putting together DI containers of Australian wine.
Mm.
So what you'd be probably looking at is importing your own containers, warehousing yourself in probably California, and then developing those relationships. So I think it's very difficult to go that route unless you have some kind of past relationships that are already in place, which we've seen people transition from being with an importer to being on their own because they have some existing distribution relationships.
Right.
Or if you plan to have someone based over in the United States, like a employee of your winery or a broker for your winery,
Right.
who might have some of those distribution relationships, because otherwise it's very hard. And distributors probably get, I mean, certainly more than us, they probably get dozens of emails every week
I'm sure.
from wineries who want to work with them. And we work with very few distributors who are like, yeah, send me new people. I'm looking. For the most part, people are like even trying to cull down their portfolios a little bit.
Yeah.
So that is a harder angle. It can ultimately be more beneficial because it does kind of give you the freedom to manage that yourself and develop that relationship yourself. And then, of course, you don't have an importer who's taking a margin. But I'd say it's a much harder one to organize if you don't have someone who knows the American market on the ground.
Correct. True. Great point. And I said you said very well in terms of the international points, because that's what we as an organizer also feel, that if you are new in the market, it adds up to the validation. And not only validation, but also in a way that you get a lot of feedback from those judges, you get a lot of shelf talkers to work back on your wine. So sometimes it helps a upcoming winery to work on their processes, work on the pricing, work on the quality.
Yeah.
All right. So once a winery secures a distributor, what are the key things they need to go to do support sales and growth?
It can change distributor to distributor. So what we tend to do is ask our distributors how we can support them. We always plan to spend time in market, and I think kind of the standard, call it ride with. I don't know if if that's what it's called in Australia, but the standard sort of ride with, well, I'll go into market, I'll ride around with one of the reps from the distributor all day, we'll see accounts. It's sort of the tried and true. We're certainly looking to be creative and do things other than that. But I will say the great benefit of that is developing a relationship with the rep from the distribution company. And
Oh,
ultimately, what we kind of see as our goal is to create ambassadors around the country for our portfolio.
nice.
And so if we have a really good day and develop a great relationship with a rep for a distribution company, hopefully they feel motivated to take the wines out, put the wines in their bag, get behind that portfolio, that they were able to hear our story, hear our producer's story, and could now go out on their own and tell those stories. Because as a winery, as an importer, we're a limited number of people, and what we need to do is like kind of instill that knowledge and enthusiasm in a lot of people around the country. And so there's certainly something to be said for doing incentives, and we're organizing a number of incentives with our distributors this year. But we've actually found in our experience, I think a lot of incentives are just money, right? Where it's like, if you open 3 new accounts, if you get three new placements, and placement
Hmm.
equals this amount of wines and blah, 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 you get this bonus money for the rep. And actually, we have not found it to be super successful. I think
Hmm.
especially for this sort of wines that we're selling, it really is like we feel like it kind of becomes just this very transactional thing. I don't think is really the pathway. And so what we are doing this year, which we are already seeing more success with, is sort of incentivizing with experiences. Like we are
Hmm.
doing a few incentive programs with a few different distributors that the kind of the prize for top sales is a trip out to Nashville for our 5th anniversary party and show in September. And we're also doing some incentives to get some of our distributors to Australia. I think this has a win-win because instead of
Correct.
just giving people money that they're going to go out and spend on whatever, you're giving them an experience which will hopefully sort of reinstill a passion for Australian wine and knowledge of Australian wine that will continue to sort of pay dividends with them selling those wines in their markets. We just did this trip to Australia. We brought 9 U.S. wine trade out to Australia and we toured them around for 10 days. It was a massive, massive undertaking,
Wow.
but it felt sort of like the key. It felt like, oh, this is what we're
True.
doing. We need to be getting
Connect.
people over to Australia so that they can really connect with the
Correct.
wineries, be in the vineyards, especially the timing we did early February, like people were literally in the vineyards that were going to be picked in the next week, where it's like now when those 2025s hit the market, I'm going to send an email to all of these buyers again and be like, hey, these grapes that
Visited.
you clearly tasted in the vineyard are now in bottle and they're coming into market. Like, I just think it's sort of the gift that keeps on giving, and people will continue to engage with Australian wine and they will be lifelong ambassadors. So I think to the extent that you can work with your importers and distributors to get people over to Australia, that is, to us, I think is going to be one of the keys to seeing long-term success.
Amazing. One question that would like to add here is how much do you want these winery to be in communication with you? So, for example, could be regarding the sales rep training program, or can be organizing some tasting sessions, or let's say some sort of merch. So, what sort of communication do you look from them?
Obviously, we don't expect them to be like intimately involved with everything that's going on in every market. We list our distributors on our website, so all of our wineries know who our distributors are. We also create quarterly sales reports for all of our wineries because we want them to be able to look and see what's doing well and what's in what market. We certainly welcome. I don't think we've ever felt like, man, leave us alone. Like, I don't think we've ever
Yeah.
felt these people won't stop communicating with us. So we certainly welcome like all the communication. I would say, yeah, it doesn't tend to get too granular in terms of what's
Hmm.
the activations that are going on in all the
Correct. Correct.
market all the time. But we communicate with our wineries quite frequently, it feels like. We try to be really responsive when we hear from them. And we'll never meet someone who has an idea or wants to engage in the market or wants to come over here, wants to support something. We'll never meet that with any
Correct.
sort of uh,
Hmm.
disdain. We really welcome involvement, and as we mentioned, like I think that partnership is what eventually makes it
True.
work.
How can wineries differentiate themselves in a market as crowded as the US?
It's not an easy question. I mean, I think the people and the stories will always be strong factors that can help differentiate you. And someone might have a better answer to this question who's like looking at the Nielsen data and like
Yeah.
wants to do something really technical, but that's not what we're doing. We're about being an advocate for Australian wine, telling the stories of, these amazing people who are making amazing wines in Australia. John and I have been able to sort of differentiate ourselves as like, we were very much on this fine dining path and then we sort of fell in love with Australia. And so I think people
Mm.
can also resonate with our story. So I think it really comes down to inspiring and motivating the people on the ground to get behind your wines. You can certainly talk about packaging in this conversation and, smart packaging, which certainly can look like a lot of different things, but investing some in good packaging that doesn't feel commercial, that doesn't feel like you've hired some marketing company to figure out what what the
Right.
US market wants, but that really just feels authentic and it feels like it represents the people and the site. I think that can certainly be really helpful. I think everyone is still
Mm.
very much influenced by visuals and certainly just, being able to represent good value, I think is always going to be a factor that helps Australia differentiate itself. And I don't necessarily mean good value, i.e. cheap. I think it
Mm.
means good value at a lot of different price points. And we
Correct.
need Australian wines over here that are $200 wholesale, like those are
Wow.
certainly going to be harder ones to sell, but I think we need to get behind Australia and say like it's not about cheap critter wine. It's about, really world-class wine that can stand toe to toe with with great wine from around the world.
Amazing. I think we have got one hand up. Hey, Lucy, do you have any question for Jane here?
Hi,
Hi.
sorry, I put it in the Q&A, but how hard is it for an Aussie producer that say sells their wine for 200 Australian dollars at the cellar door to that's unknown to the US market? How hard is it for them to enter?
So just make sure I'm understanding. So the question was how hard, if someone's selling their wine for $200 at the Australian cellar door, how hard is it for them to enter the US market?
Yes, and they're unknown in the US market.
Yeah, I mean, obviously price is a factor. I really think there is some room for it. There's certainly a pricing conversation to be had, and you can't, what you're selling for $200 at the cellar door, you can't sell it to someone, your importer, for $200, because it ideally needs to, our kind of goal is that what a price is in Australia, what, like, if something retails for $200 in Australia, that we can get it kind of close to that in US dollars in the US. So you'd sort of need to give your importer what you would give like an out of state wholesaler, what the price you would give them in Australia. Again, we're not talking about, it doesn't need to be cheap, but it needs to be kind of commensurate value with what that wine sort of hits the market for in the US, in Australia, excuse me. It is more a matter of finding importers and distributors who really want to get on board and get behind those wines. I know Castania in Beechworth works with a guy in California. Actually, I think he might have moved, but it doesn't matter. And those wines are for the most part more, pretty premium, quite expensive. This guy is a friend of ours. He's a master sommelier. He's sold a lot of really expensive wines, but he was actually a little surprised by how hard it was to sell those wines because it's Australia, right? And so a lot of people aren't used to they're used to spending that kind of money on, Premier Cru Burgundy,
Yeah.
but not Australian wine. But I do think there are definitely markets in the US that are hungry for expensive wine. You go to Las Vegas, and every time I go to Las Vegas, the wine I sell the most of is the most expensive wine in my bag. Every single time. We have not shied away from having some of those wines in our portfolio, and I think you can also look at them as sort of halo wines, right? Where it's like, okay, so maybe someone won't buy the $200 wine, but it's gonna make the rest of the portfolio look really good that it's in the company of this wine. And so maybe they'll be like, oh, cool. Well, I loved your $200 wine. So maybe I'm going to put your more affordable wine on by the glass if there is sort of that balance in the portfolio. So I think there's opportunity for it. It's just convincing sort of the importers and the distributors to get on board. And I think if you do have a good brand story, if you have some history in Australia that can be pointed to, and if you have some really good international points, those things all really help with selling expensive wine.
Before closing, do you have any closing remarks for the Australian wineries in general?
Yeah, it has been harder than we thought it would be to sell Australian wine in the US. Both my husband and I, we worked for a long time as buyers in the US. We have great relationships over here. And so I thought it was going to be easier than it has been. It's also, it was COVID, and then,
True.
it's sort of a wild few years. But I just think with any category, it does take some time. And I think it takes time to change the way market looks at Australian wine, at any category. We see it working. They're the states that we've had really good reciprocal relationships with our distributors who've been able to really reach the accounts, that we see it working, that we just will get a random PO that has, 28 cases on it because they got a new BTG or they got a wine club. And it does
Hmm.
sort of tick away. One thing we're also very conscious of is sort of the settings and the occasions that people are going to drink Australian wine. And I think, if you look at sort of the rise of Spanish wine in the
Yeah.
US, it was directly correlated with the rise of tapas restaurants. And it's actually really interesting to see. There's at least a handful that I know of kind of Australian cafes that are opening up around the country. So I do think there is an interest in Australian culture, food culture. Think more so than like individual foods or food cuisine, but I think that can evolve too. And we're, excited to see that grow because one of the things we love about Australian wine is how it really is. There's a culture around wine drinking and a really appreciation and love of wine. And it's really a part of, day-to-day life in a very everyday sort of way that I think can be really contagious for Americans. So I think that's something that we're also really conscious of is how can we continue to promote Australian culture and get people just looking at Australia in general and then the trickle down effect to Australian wine in a more premium light. Obviously, we've been working against some of the perceptions of Australian wine in the United States. And I certainly don't blame any producers. A lot of people are like, yellowtail. And it's like, sure, yeah, yellowtail, but every country has its yellowtail. It just is sort of a shame, a series of events sort of came together to basically, there was just only a handful of Australian wines on the shelves for a long time in the US, and that became what people thought about as Australian wine, that it was either big, bold Shiraz or it was cheap critter wine. And I think, so we're working against that to say, yes, Australia represents great value, but it's great value from these amazing, small artisan producers at every price point. So we're, this is our first year doing the Sommelier's Choice Awards, but we're really excited because the caliber, I think the thing we're most excited about is just the caliber of judges is so great that we're excited to be on the ground there with them, showing them these wines that they'll then hopefully take back to their markets and be like, oh man, the Australian showing was phenomenal. I really got to work some more Australian wine into my wine program. And I think that's definitely a realistic outcome of the awards.